Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the top political stories of the day. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Editor-in-Chief Jeff Palais, filling in for our host, Victoria Rose. Thanks for being with us. Today, we're joined by Donald Palmer, the Commissioner of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, or E.A.C. for short. The E.A.C's mission is to help ensure safe and accessible elections across the country, and we're excited to hear about some of their work straight from the source today. It's been Palmer's life work to do the same. Before being appointed commissioner in 2019 by former President Donald Trump and being unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate, Palmer had held positions in Virginia as both the Secretary of the State Board of Elections and the state's chief election official. He has also served as Florida's Director of Elections and was a trial attorney with the voting section in the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. I've known Don for a few years now, and I'm excited to finally have him on the program. Don, it's great to see you.
It's great to see you too. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited. We've been kicking this around for a while. So I think a lot of people have probably heard of the E.A.C. and the work your team does there. But start us out by telling us a little bit about the organization, maybe in sort of like a layperson terms. What is the E.A.C. and how does it actually impact voters?
So the E.A.C. is a bipartisan commission. And what that means is it's led by commissioners on both sides of the aisle that are sort of nominated by the leaders of the House and Senate. And it came after the 2000 election. And so that was part of the Help America Vote Act that came out of there, where there were, the issues about the voting machines and whether or not they were tabulating correctly and accurately. And so it really came out of that. And it has a limited role in support of election officials on the ground who are actually administering the elections. And so the federal government, helps certify and test voting systems. It helps provide grant money when the Congress decides to appropriate. It will collect data and then submit reports. And so it plays a supportive role at the federal government. And so it's not really intruding on the way that states and localities administer their elections.
We at Ballotpedia always look forward to those reports when they come out. They're a really useful and valuable tool. And what about your role as commissioner? So what would you say are your typical sort of primary responsibilities?
Well, we discuss often the policies of the commission, and, it helps us come down to, a middle of the road approach. We all have to work together and with the goal of supporting election officials. And so we do a lot of travel and discussion with local and state officials in the field. And so I may be going to conferences. Next week, I'll be visiting a few states and talking to officials or stakeholders that are involved in the process. Because as you know, there's a lot of scrutiny, both from on-election officials, by legislatures, by the Congress, by the political parties.
Yeah, it's certainly gotten a lot more attention now than it probably used to. So I think much of our conversation today will revolve around some of the voting technology that E.A.C. has been refining and rolling out. But let's kind of step back big picture first. So the confidence in the American public of the integrity of our elections has been declining, I think, in recent years. That's probably not a controversial statement. What do you see as the biggest reasons contributing to that?
I think that there's uninformed individuals that make comments. I think the news media really doesn't have a handle on how we do elections and how we test in voting machines. And so, when there's allegations or stories on voting machines were hacked and results might have been changed, there's really little basis for that. They don't really understand the process. And, I see that as what challenge to me is that we need to do a better job of informing not only the public, but sort of the media and folks that they build that narrative. And so that's why I build relationships, and we may visit an accredited lab. We may host meetings and discuss sort of the mechanics of elections. So there's little confusion as to why and what we're doing. There's no black box. This is how we do it. And this is why you can count on the results.
It sounds kind of like what you're getting at is it's a really good system and people should trust it. That's kind of what I'm hearing from that answer there.
What we do is we set those standards. And so there's really a regimented way of testing those standards in our labs. We test in those accredited labs, and then we audit those labs to make sure they're doing the proper testing. And so that's one of our primary duties under the Help America Vote Act.
And you've been in the election administration game, as I said at the top, for a long time. You've seen a lot with how Americans vote. A lot of people know about the big and obvious changes, right? We've gone from the hanging chads in 2000 to predominantly electronic voting. But I'm curious, what are some of the behind the scenes major changes that listeners might not know about that you've seen in your time in the election administration space? Like what are some of your favorite or most interesting changes that have happened?
Well, I think the big change was HAVA. I was entering the Department of Justice as a trial attorney, and HAVA had just passed. And I got to see how the states tried to implement that. And so there were some failures on the part of states. I also saw that with the overseas and military laws. And so these laws are difficult for counties and states to comply with. We had to force it at times through the courts. We had to work with them. That was when I was at the Department of Justice. When I went into election administration, transitioning from one voting system to another is a pretty difficult process, particularly in an election year. So those are some of the challenges behind the scenes. The public probably doesn't know this, but for the past basically decade, we've been developing new voting system standards. And so we rolled them out last year. We have accredited labs to that. We have a new system that we're testing in that lab. That took a full decade of election officials working with experts and the public and the National Institute of Standards and Technology to develop those standards. And so that's probably something the public doesn't know about. But there's a lot of folks that have been involved in making our voting systems more secure, more audible, more accessible.
You're probably right that most people don't know this. So let's dig into that a little bit. What does it mean to have voting systems and standards, and how does all that work? Isn't voting simply as simple as counting up the votes and tabulating them, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, it's a little bit more complicated because it's sort of like the debate over hand counting. There's a lot of errors that can occur in that process because we're humans. That's one reason to take some of the potential fraud or the inaccuracies out of that process. Machines started to be used. So you could tabulate thousands or hundreds of thousands and now millions of ballots with no mistakes. But to do that takes sort of using modern technology, and you don't really do anything without, at least the federal government. There's a bunch of industries out there that we set standards at the federal, voluntary standards at the federal government level, and then we test to those. And so that's a process. And prior to 2020, prior to the 2000 election, for example, there were some voluntary standards out there, but I think the Congress wanted to create the E.A.C. And have those standards developed by the experts in the field and then roll those out on a voluntary basis for the states, because it was just a haphazard certification process across the country. And there was very little uniformity and accuracy and security. And so that's why we did that, is that we could have sort of a voluntary federal involvement in the process.
Yeah, coming up with standards is, maybe there's a helpful metaphor that you have, or you can come up with to compare this for listeners to something in the non-political or non-electoral world, because in a lot of industries, standards are kind of jointly developed among industry participants, and you kind of come to an agreement on that, and that's a very helpful thing for consumers in the end. One thing I'm thinking about from recent news was Tesla and GM and Ford agreed upon the adapter charging port for EVs. Is there anything like that you can think of that would help listeners understand why voting standards matter and how that compares?
No, I think the last time I checked, there was about 20 industries, for example, that have standards, and NIST works with them to develop those standards. For example, car efficiency, gas efficiency, or safety standards. They're going to be gradually improved over the years, just like voting standards. So something from 10 years ago, with the new technology, new security features, and the new threats, obviously, you want to improve your standards that you're testing to. It generally will improve the functioning of that voting system for what's important to you. And so what's important to the voters and the community is, well, obviously, we want to have these systems tabulate ballots accurately. We want it to be secure from any sort of outside intrusion. We want it to be accessible for voters with disabilities. We want it to be usable for all voters, so it's an easy process to come and vote. So we set the standards, we develop those requirements, and then we'll do the testing, and we test to those standards. It's one reason why we may have older systems in the field. We have a 1.0 and then we have a 2.0. We may have older systems in the field. We still have confidence in that they're secure and will continue to operate in the field, but that doesn't mean we won't move forward with new standards and try to incentivize new manufacturers to bring in those systems for use by the public. And so it's sort of an evolving thing. It's just like we don't take cars off the streets when we have a new version of miles per gallon, right? You're going to keep those on there on the streets, and you don't just pull them because you've raised the mileage requirements or the safety standards. So while we want to work toward new standards and new voting equipment, we have full confidence that our old voting systems are working properly.
Yeah, that makes sense. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges at this present moment in the election administration space?
Well, some of the challenges, I mean, what we're having is, unfortunately, you have a lot of expectations of election officials. There's a lot of scrutiny, and in many ways, that's good. But there are some incidents that have occurred with intimidation, and what you find and what we're finding is that folks are leaving the field, and so you have a lot of professionals that have been around a while, and they are leaving the community, and so we're replacing it. It gives us a challenge that we have to increase training. We have to have professional courses and try to get the new officials up to speed so they administer the election efficiently and without any sort of incident. That is a huge challenge for the community itself. And obviously, when you're implementing, as we discussed, new voting standards, that is a challenge because as localities adopt those, they're going to want to buy and purchase new voting systems. And frankly, elections have been underfunded systemically, and finding resources to purchase the new voting systems is always an issue. And since I've been in the community, it's an issue. And even prior to that, I mean, with HAVA, you had with those requirements under HAVA now 2 decades ago, there was some money attached to it. There was appropriation attached to it, in total about over $3 billion. And it helped those localities and states sort of purchase the new voting technology.
Yeah, we've seen some of those articles in the last few months about the election administration employees, the clerks, the town manager, clerks, deputy clerks, things like that, who are responsible for administering elections, who in many cases are, in most cases, probably in fact, are, they're not political figures. They're hired like anybody else is hired into a job or profession. And a lot of them are leaving. There are tens and tens of thousands of election officials who maintain our elections, and that's kind of what you're getting at, right? They're leaving the space and they're being replaced. And the question is, are they being replaced at sufficient enough speed to deal with that turnover, I guess?
That is the concern. And look, I mean, I understand that at some point people retire, they maybe move on to a new career, but it is a challenge both at the state and local level, because, that experience is not something you can buy, right? You can buy competency if you pay people enough. But the experience of going through elections, when that person walks out the door, it's tough. It's tough. And then you've got to train that person for the next, election, which is, for example, the presidential around the corner. I mean, we consider that the hurricane of elections. It's like you have your run-of-the-mill election, and then there's the presidential election where Katie bar the door.
Right. I wonder if our listeners, I'm certain, don't realize this, but most elections in the country are run at a pretty hyper-local level. So most people, when they think about elections, think about state and federal. But one of my favorite stories is that in Texas, school districts can opt to run their own elections if they want to. They don't have to have the county run it even. You can literally have a school district decide how they run their elections. So if you think about it through that perspective, it could be there's just a ton of local control. So I wonder what you think about this statement. If there continues to be this retirement sort of movement and there's a little slowdown in replacements, does that eventually lead to more centralization of election administration as districts and counties have a harder time filling those positions and maintaining that expertise? Does that lead to states taking a movement to centralize through a state agency?
Well, it's possible because, I mean, I think that's a good point. I think that if you're having problems funding or recruiting professional administrators, at some point there has to be some change, right? And what does that mean? Perhaps the state gets more involved. Maybe it's some sort of other ways of administering elections. And so I think you have a point there. And it has been a concern. And I think that elections it's not even just the professional administrator. When you really think about it, and I talk about it a lot, is those elections are often in the polling place with the poll workers. And we've also seen a decrease in poll workers that are available to work. And so when the rubber hits the road, it's those poll workers and those polling chiefs inside that little schoolhouse, for example, that are actually facilitating the right to vote. So you've got to make sure you have a good administrator who's coordinating all these poll workers working in the polls, because that's really where the rubber meets the road and people get to cast their ballots in an effective way.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about poll workers, and you kind of just spoke to it, that they're, in addition to election administrators, there's a reduction in poll workers. And now that we're kind of talking about it, I wonder if one of the, played out scenarios would be, okay, so you have fewer election administration officials and you have fewer poll workers. Does that lead to potentially a push toward more mail-in voting? Because people will say, well, if you don't have any poll workers, then why don't we just move to mail-in voting? Because you don't need poll workers and poll volunteers. And in that case, is that something that has been discussed? Is something the E.A.C has heard about before? Or what do you think might happen there?
I have heard. I've heard that, sometimes tough choices have to be made. If you can't fund an adequate number of polling places or recruit enough poll workers, you saw this in 2020. You saw where they had to have more vote centers or they had to have more mail voting, not because they made a policy decision, but it was just the logistics of it. I think it was in Kentucky. And it was, this is one reason why I tell legislators all the time, man, you need to adequately fund your elections if you want to maintain, an efficient in-person voting experience that many Americans love. You got to make sure you have your polling places ready to go and they're open and you have enough of them. Otherwise, people have a negative experience and it will impact them in the voting experience. And it's not always about the money. That, this is a service to Americans. And so if you're trying to cut the number of polling places and you say, well, we'll just create an early voting site or we'll shift to some other form of voting like voting by mail, I think that's short-sighted because you're making decisions based on how much money I can cut and not what's to the benefit of voters and what are their expectations. And so I encourage them to fund the election infrastructure and make sure that they've got poll workers and they're ready to go on election day. The pandemic obviously was different. I mean, in many ways, you had jurisdictions that had to somehow shift, like I raised Kentucky. They have to shift to some other way of voting because they're not getting enough poll workers to serve. You can't even get offices to open, much less serve as a polling place. So, that was a unique thing. And we deal with unique factors all the time. Let's say it's a hurricane or a superstorm Sandy or a snowstorm. There are going to be contingencies that election officials have to be prepared for. The pandemic was very unique, and you did see ways that we had to accommodate what was going on in the country. But the legislatures have the final role on that. But I would just say that we need to invest in our elections and not always look for ways to reduce budgets.
Right. Still cliche, but you get what you pay for, I guess. The story about how we're covering elections now, it always reminds me of, I'm a history major originally, and it's fun to look back on the history of how, elections were governed because this isn't new, counting votes. When the coronavirus pandemic started up, one of the things that we did is we went back and started reading newspaper clips from 1918 and 1919. And, there were lots of stories about we couldn't open this polling booth because people were scared about the flu, or, World War I was happening and people weren't able to vote. And America has always been able to overcome those kinds of challenges. These aren't new. There's always been all sorts of challenges with collecting and counting and tabulating the votes. And sometimes we can learn from some of those stories. So I'm kind of curious, do you have any sort of favorite historical stories like that are sort of interesting or inspiring to think back on?
Well, I think that I did a paper a while back. We talked about, it was about absentee voting and a little bit of early voting in it. And it really was, why did we have reforms for in-person voting? Why did we have the private ballot? And we used to have a system where it was not private, right? It was very, very much open to the public. There was not a lot of privacy. And therefore, you had a lot of probably improper, persuasion or influencing of the vote. So there was a series of reforms that really created, the in-person of private voting experience. And so I like to talk about how we evolved through that, but it took a decade of reform to get to a point in this country where you could go inside a polling place and vote in person in private and not have to be required to basically disclose what your vote was.
So when did that all happen?
Yeah, I think it was the 1800s and mid 1800s approximately, and where we started to move to the Australian ballot process. Where it was more of a polling place experience that was private and not public. We used to vote in public, and I did an analysis of absentee voting and the importance of voting in your precinct, and it was very interesting because you had the Civil War. You had the Revolutionary War, you had the Civil War, and it was so strict that in some cases you could not, you had to vote in your precinct, even if you were in the military. But in the Civil War, you had your first instances of absentee balloting or even early voting on or near the battlefields, which is very interesting to me. There's a history of how we evolved on mail balloting, absentee balloting, particularly for the military. And I found it very interesting because we were pretty rigid in sort of the absentee and mail voting all the way up until really the state of Oregon adopted it, and sort of they went down the road of mail balloting.
That is really interesting. Yeah, there's so much great history to be uncovered about how Americans' electoral system has taken place. So I have a few final topics I want to dig on. They're kind of a little more current event related. So the first one is about NACED. So there's been an interesting sort of back and forth with NACED and the E.A.C recently, and there was a response to NACED's letter. I'm kind of just curious to ask you a little bit about all that, to tell our listeners just kind of really succinctly about the story going on with E.A.C and NACED.
They did. I was a member of NACED for about a decade. And so I think if we're talking about the same issue, I mean, they have been involved with sort of the implementation of VBSG 2.0. And they wanted to have it clear that we would be able to communicate as an agency, a federal agency, to support how we are going to transition from the old standards to the new standards. And the difficulty in this being a presidential election year, or we're going to be coming up very soon, how are we going to communicate to the public about this transition and how we are moving forward? And I talk about it as building a bridge from 1.0 to 2.0, and that the public can be confident in those voting systems that are 1.0. We talked a little bit about that earlier. And I think NACED, they have the same concerns because they have their public, their citizens, they may hear about VBSG 2.0 and the fact that they've been adopted, but they haven't been fully implemented or placed into the field. And that's the piece that the public needs to understand, is just because we've set up labs and there are some testing going on, it doesn't mean like tomorrow we're going to be able to vote. So we're working with the National Association of State Election Directors, which is NACED, on a communications plan, for the public, really, so they will understand, they'll be able to communicate to their public and to their voters that if they have a E.A.C certified system or a state certified system, that is, they can have confidence in those voting systems. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they necessarily must have 2.0 systems by 2024, that the public's going to have to be a bit patient with that as the manufacturers bring those systems into the field, and then those states are able to purchase them for use at the local level.
Yeah, very interesting. It's hard to get people to really pay attention to all that. It's something that we find fascinating over at Ballotpedia, because so many of our readers are what we like to say are once every 2 year readers, because they have their busy lives, they have a lot that they focus and worry about, and they don't really want to worry about political events and elections until they have to vote. And then when they want to vote, they want to come, they want to learn, they want to quickly get in and out. And that's great. We love to be here as a resource for them, but probably don't want to hear too much about this. That's a challenge to engage with them. So I've got two more little rapid fire lightning round questions for you then. So E.A.C has been in the news this year quite a bit. The Electronic Registration Information Center, for listeners who don't follow what E.A.C is. Is that something that surprised you that it got this kind of attention? Because you were involved in it sort of when you were back in Virginia. And what do you make of what's going on with E.A.C and its attention to the news this year and last year?
Well, I mean, I was in Virginia. Virginia was one of the founding members of E.A.C. And, E.A.C is designed really to try to fulfill some of the recommendations over the years of experts that the states needed to share data with each other, registration data and voter history, so we could compare the voter lists and try to keep them accurate, and also try to combat voter fraud. I mean, voter fraud, there have been instances where individuals will vote in one state and another. And so the only way to prosecute those is to collect that data and have evidence. So, a district attorney or a prosecutor could then enforce the law. And so, I think that one of the problems that ERIC has had and will continue to have is sort of when you have members, it's like a bipartisan commission that we have the E.A.C. We always have to work on maintaining that there's no conflicts of interest, that there's no partisanship as much as we can avoid it, and trying to find consensus. And I think ERIC is made up of states, and they've got to find their way on finding consensus moving forward. And if they can't do so with Republicans, independents, and Democrats alike, they're going to have difficulty. And most folks. I was a member of ERIC. I was a member of the board, not the board, but the sort of the initial group. And there's election administrators from all different stripes, Democrat, Republican, and they have to work together. And it has to be done in a nonpartisan, bipartisan way. And I think that's really the future of ERIC, is if they can find a way to move forward in a bipartisan way, then they'll succeed.
Last question for you then. Where do you see election administration going in the next 10 years? I know the new voting standards is a great part of that, but if we're here in 10 years, what do you think the election voting space is going to look like? What do you see coming?
I think that there will be a lot more training and professional training. That's one of the things we're working on here at the E.A.C. I think it's become a much more difficult job than it was 10, 20 years ago. Now, not only you have to run an election, but you also have to be concerned about cybersecurity issues, and you have to be concerned about all the federal laws you need to comply with. It's a multifaceted, complex job. And frankly, with that additional training, perhaps, and professionalism, there'll be increases in pay, and there'll be a recognition of the great job that they do. And obviously, there'll be more scrutiny. I think the more scrutiny you have on the more training, I think localities will be more willing to pay additional funds for folks to do that. So that's a big issue, because it's those are the people running your elections. And I also think that we'll be probably trying to implement more of those recommendations about data sharing across state lines, supporting localities, and doing their registration list maintenance.
You think we'll ever have online voting?
I don't think. I think there may be certain forms of it for, let's say, the overseas and military, but I don't think you'll have full online voting. Even in a Eastern European state like Estonia that actually has online voting, it's one of the few. They only about 30 to 40%, I think I have my numbers right, actually vote online. The others will vote in person or early. And so I think that it may someday become part of our process, but I wouldn't say in the next 5 to 10 years.
Don, thanks so much for joining us. And it's great to have you on the show today. We'll look forward to seeing some of the upcoming EVES report in the next few weeks, which is one of the really big E.A.C. reports that comes out after every election cycle. We'll share some notes for listeners on how they can follow you, Don, and your podcast and keep up with all the E.A.C.'s activities.
Oh, I really appreciate it, Jeff. I really do. I just saw that you and Ballotpedia were recognized for your 15 years anniversary. Congratulations.
That's right. Thank you. That's right. It's our 15th year, and this year it's my 14th now.
I'm a big reader and a consumer of your data, and I really appreciate all the information that Ballotpedia puts out there, and it's great. Hopefully there's areas that we can work with y'all in the future, because part of our job is getting that information out to the public, and you guys do a great job with that.
Thank you, Don. We appreciate that.